it's any consolation, we're going to edit it to make you guys look perfect.
Well, in my eyes, Julia is already perfect.
Well done. Well done. Yeah, so well, briefly, I'll just say, I just was talking with Julia briefly. She's in Kiev right now. I miss that city. I would
Have
like
you
to,
been here?
yes, a bunch of times. I actually did some filming there.
Oh, wow.
And have thought I've been invited to come back because, obviously it's an intense time to be there. And
Yeah, there's a lot to film. No.
And Jimmy and I know each other for many, many years. We met at Sundance, and then stayed in touch, and then he ended up acting in a bizarre, funny movie with me about air drummers. He played a expert air drummer from Haiti, which is where he's from. Just for a little bit of introduction, so you guys all know what I'm doing here, is this project that I'm creating called Fogtown is Michelle is coming in for some reason. Maybe, I'm not sure why, but Michelle, maybe she's just checking. I didn't know you were coming by, Michelle. There's Michelle.
Hi, Michelle.
Jimmy.
Hello.
Michelle. Julia.
Nice to meet you. I just wanted to make sure everyone was on. I'm actually gonna hop off, but I'm glad you guys are all on the Zoom. And have a good interview. Nice to meet you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Michelle.
Nice to meet you.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
Michelle.
Take care.
We have this project called Fogtown, which is about a community that is, a frontline community dealing with climate change, but in the context of fiction and action adventure, and working to tell the kind of story that could work with a mainstream audience rather than feeling like education and homework, with the idea that we as storytellers are trying to figure out good ways to wake people up to what is going on the planet, and especially in frontline communities, Caribbean communities like Haiti, as we mess with the planet. So I'm working on telling a story like that, and realize that there are other people also who care about that, and to have a magazine that includes conversations between different types of, activists, culture makers, and just have people meet and talk about their ideas about how we can wake people up. So this is the purpose of the magazine. I'm going to be releasing the first issue at Cannes in a month. And so that's what we're doing in the interview. So just for clarity.
Thank you so
Cool.
much for the context. Yeah.
So we have been kind of bringing together different people from different backgrounds, and the two of you are now in the hot seat, but
We're here. We're here. Yeah.
but Julia, we've just met. Jimmy, we've known each other for a long time, but Julia, do you want to share a little bit about your activism and what you're doing as a leader? And
As a leader, it's a big word. Yeah. Well, it's hard to describe it, but I think, yeah. So I'm Julia. I come from Ukraine, from a small rural countryside of Kiev region. I spent most of my life here. I then went to actually do an exchange program in the US. So I lived in Louisiana for a year, fun fact. And
You meet lots of Haitians there.
sorry?
Did you meet Haitians in
Yes.
Louisiana?
Yes, quite a few. Yeah, and I had a friend who also worked, I think, on some sort of initiative that was related to Haiti. I don't remember what it was specifically because it was quite a few years ago. So, but yeah, I've met quite a few Haitians, and I And then I went to study at NYU, but Abu Dhabi, which is a very interesting place to be. But because I got a scholarship essentially there, like full financial aid, and that's the only reason why, sorry, the light, I think I need to move. Yeah, that's the only reason why I was able to sort of like receive US education. But then I returned back to Ukraine in 2021, sort of started my adult life here, and then kind of, you know, what happened a little bit later. In the beginning of 2022, Russia invaded my country. I was personally impacted. My parents, my dad and my grandparents survived Russian occupation. They lived under it for about a month during the siege of Kyiv. But my activism sort of, so to speak, started when I realized that there's not enough Ukrainian voices in just overall English-speaking media that are talking about the detrimental effects of, at that time, of this looming invasion, this buildup of Russian troops, and just overall can talk a little bit about the history, about the context of this war that has been happening actually for longer, for 9 years, not for one, because Russia invaded us in 2014. And I've noticed this very much. There was like a lot of just sort of American dudes who studied Russian history and were talking a lot about the situation in Ukraine, but there's not real like Ukrainians on Western media. So that's how I sort of started speaking to the media, creating my content around that, and just using all of the platforms that I could to bring out information from Ukraine. And then the way I kind of like got to, care about the climate as well was back in the university as well. Because I was a part of some climate activist groups. Well, that was very interesting because I studied in one of the biggest oil producing countries, which is the UAE. And I think like, yeah, I saw the effects of that on just overall on society as well. But then obviously the question of how dependent Europe and the rest of the world is on like fossil fuels that come from Russia, from this dictatorship regime, how that is like directly linked to the war and how that's what enables Putin. So I got to work with some of the Eastern European activists on that as well, because they really, really worked hard to amplify Ukrainian voices in that moment and to show how we are the people who are directly suffering from that. So that's sort of, I guess that's a little bit overextended summary, but yeah.
Mhm. Wow, that's a lot, and that's good.
Well, I'm curious to know, as because we're the climate issue, and obviously Russia is a petrol state. I guess my question, because this is such a large subject we're tackling, is how we change the way we think about energy, the way we think about the planet. Well, I'd love to hear a little bit from Jimmy too, because such a different background coming from Haiti, but there's some parallels in terms of dealing with outside forces and internal forces that have made life difficult in the country. And the main thing for me is figuring out how do we amplify voices? How do we tell the stories that can catch people's attention? And do you want to talk a little bit, Jimmy, about your own experience as an actor, but also as someone who, is comfortable talking about issues in Haiti, but also Uganda and other places that you feel?
Yeah. Well, I'm an actor, Julia, and I've been in the business here in the States since the late 90s. This is when I met Ari, actually, in 99 at the Sundance.
That's when I was born.
Oh, wow, one generation above. But yeah, so I've been around for quite a few years, doing all kind of acting jobs throughout the world. I should say that I was born in Haiti, but I also grew up in Paris. I lived in in Spain, Italy, South Africa, England, before I moved to Los Angeles. And I did all kind of things as an actor. And one of the main project was a TV show called Heroes, in which I played a character called the Haitian. And being the Haitian, being a hero on national television, and Heroes being the #1 show around the world, that sort of gave me a solid platform to start speaking about the problems that I see in my country, which is Haiti. Shortly after that, I came up with my own foundation called Hollywood Unites for Haiti. That was in 2008. And then in 2010, we had a huge earthquake, which completely destroyed the country. So I did some more work with all kind of other organizations, and leading up to about 3 years ago, maybe 2 years now, our president got assassinated by forces that nobody don't seems to understand, even though it's very clear who might be behind that. So as a Haitian, I've always tried to put my fingers where I could potentially have reactions and answers. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Paris. I was invited to be the master of ceremony of a big event that took place at the Pantheon. And it was around the national Haitian hero called Toussaint Louverture. Actually, I played Toussaint Louverture in a biopic in 2012. But because we are in the Pantheon in Paris, in front of some of the ministers, in front of some of the ex-prime minister of France, I sort of completely went off protocol and decided to write and read a letter to the president, Emmanuel Macron, about the situation in Haiti, which is a letter I can send you, Ari. I don't know if I sent that to you.
No, I didn't know about this. That's crazy.
Yeah, that was just 2 weeks ago. So I've sent him the letter, and of course the letter got to him, and I'm waiting for an answer right now as we speak. And just to say that, the Haitian situation has been ongoing for, since 1804, which is when Haiti got their independence against France. And more specifically, since 86, which is when they got rid of one of the Haitian dictator, Duvalier. That's when the country started to go down and down and down and down. And up until now, right now, Haiti is not a place that I could go to, even though I'm Haitian. I can't invite my friends. I would never be able to invite Ari back to Haiti right now because it's so dangerous. And the situation is catastrophic, but nobody's doing anything about it. But we all know who could be behind it. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, it's about strategic positioning for some of the superpowers. It's about what can they gain from that region, from the country, and who can benefit from a place like Haiti. So I understand your fight. I understand your struggle with your position as well, with your country in regard of Europe, in regards of the rest of the world, in regard of the resources that you have in place that other people might want to profit from. But at the end of the day, we have people that are dying because of that kind of situation. So when we have a voice, I think it's good to try to use that voice as best as possible to try to not necessarily change the big issues, but to press on some of the subject matters to make sure that we stay focused on what matters. And if we stay focused, then it might take a few years, but change will come. But change starts by one person by one action. And I strongly believe in that. One person can bring change, but change doesn't happen in one day. It might take years and sometimes a century for real change, but someone's got to start.
Yeah. I hadn't even thought when this pairing came up between you, how much they're, both of your countries have been in a state of kind of like being pawns for bigger powers outside. I also, because there's an ecological aspect to this magazine, my perspective as a global citizen always is like looking at what's happening to the land in the place. Haiti has been, the soil in Haiti has been largely messed up, washed into the sea. The war in Ukraine obviously is, and some of it's taking place in the breadbasket, but also one can make the argument that all of the cultural talk from the Russian side, from Putin's side, is really just a cover for the fact that there's a lot of mineral riches in the East. You want to talk a little bit about that, Julia, and your sense of how much, culture is a cover for ecological harvesting of the planet?
Yeah, I think it's definitely could be an aspect, but I think I wanna outline that I think the narrative of obviously United States and Europe and everybody else has interest in whatever they're doing in helping Ukraine right now. And unfortunately, that interest does not always align with ours, because if it did align with ours, I think the situation would be very different, and we would have gotten a little bit more assurance and security guarantees earlier on. And it's very difficult for me to take on that narrative of just Ukraine being a pawn between obviously the two powers, because I think that removes the agency of Ukrainians in Ukraine, who have been fighting against Russians and have been oppressed by Russia for essentially centuries. And I grew up learning stories about Stalin in the USSR starving my grandparents, and they had to walk, and that the denial of land, sorry, the light in this box keeps and obviously Ukraine as a natural resource was really crucial to the Soviet Union and to just overall to Europe, because as my grandparents were literally starving, great-grandparents were starving to death, Stalin was selling all of the grain from Ukraine to Europe and other countries, and nobody was bothered for what was the reality of Ukrainians at that time. And I think a lot of Ukrainian activists have been alarming the EU and other countries about making any sort of business deals with the Russian gas pipeline, and their efforts to sort of overcome and sell their fossil fuel resources to Germany and other countries without realizing what kind of dependency politically it creates and what kind of stake it would be, which Ukraine's fate. And so I think Putin invading Ukraine, he knew that whatever sanctions and whatever economic response or political response that could come from Europe was basically halted by the fact that Europe is very much dependent on the fossil fuels, because instead of creating their own independent, sustainable energy infrastructure and overall system, they've been just going the easier way, which is just buying fossil fuels from Russia, with the fact that they're interested in Ukraine's minerals and, just natural resources. That's very interesting to me because Russia is so big. Like, why would they care about just few pieces of land? But they do care somehow, because if you look at the satellite imagery at now occupied Ukrainian territories in the east of Ukraine, they've been cutting out the forests as if Russia doesn't have enough forests. I mean, like, I'm not saying that they should cut any forests, but it's kind of funny how they're coming here and paying such a high price. It's like losing lives of people and, not caring about the lives of their own citizens just to, then cut some trees. Like, that's just totally crazy for me. And the cultural aspect, like, obviously it's a cover up for probably a lot of different geopolitical and economical interests of Russia overall, but it is still something that a lot of people, I think, misunderstand about Ukraine. A lot of people still believe that, like, oh, Ukrainians are Russians and Russians are the same nation or like similar culture, whatever language, without really being able to put the same colonial lens and the understanding that Ukrainians have also been colonized by the Russian Empire, then the neo-Russian empires like Soviet Union and others for centuries. And I think it's really hard to understand that when, I studied at NYU, and pretty much any kind of colonial discussion about post-USSR, post-Russian Empire states in Eastern Europe have been completely absent from any intellectual or academic discourse. And I think that's when going back to, what Jimmy was saying about Haiti and that relationship with France, which is obviously like the effects of that and the impact of that colonization is what led to Haiti right now. And I think I wish there was more like dialogue between the kind of like countries or people from the kind of countries like ours, because then
Well, there is right now.
Yeah, there is right now. But I think that's a
Yeah.
great opportunity to understand each other. Obviously, I'm not saying that it's like the same copy-pasted situation. There's like a lot of nuances, but I think a lot of the times there are way more parallels that you would probably imagine or learn anywhere else, but through this kind of dialogue.
I mean, it's really
Yeah,
interesting
I
to me
did
that,
that.
oh, go ahead.
At the end of the day, it's true. It does come down to human greed and economic power, and for any cost necessary, it's almost like history repeating itself in different parts of the world, and we as humans are not really learning from our past mistakes, because unfortunately what's happening in Ukraine now, it's nothing new. We have the same thing happening at the same time in many parts of the world, and it's quite amazing how careless the people in power are when it comes to really trying to solve the problems, and try to put the people first and not the interest or the economic gain first. So it's a big dialogue. I think it's interesting what you're doing now, Ari, to be able to have that conversation. I would love to actually speak more with Julia, just about little things, about experience, everyday experience, how if she even views the world, in regards of her own situation right now. I think it's very interesting to start comparing the experiences that someone like me would have in the Caribbean with someone like you up there in Europe. But we'll find so many similarities. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think in terms of colonialism, there is a lens that, those who do, let's say, colonial studies in the West, there's a psychology where like people want to blame their own culture, and they'll say, okay, America did these things in the Caribbean or they did these things in Central America, but we don't know how to include what China does in Tibet or what Russia does in Ukraine.
Yeah.
So we don't include, let's say, Tibet or Ukraine under the lens of, victims of colonialism, because, I think it's sort of a guilt-based, intellectual background that somehow says we're not allowed to criticize Russia or China specifically as colonial powers under the same lens. And, as you said, Julia, it's not a copy paste situation, the things are different, but there are probably more similarities in the fundamentals than there are differences, because as Jimmy said, greed is the driving force, whether it's cultural greed, trying to stamp out someone's culture, or essentially post-slavery greed and trying to have a population that you can underpay and use, or ecological greed and raping the planet and taking the resources, and who cares who lives there and who cares what the end result is. All of these things are actually more similar than they are different. And I think it's a cool thing to start looking for parallels between the different, I don't like the word victims, but between different cultures that are suffering under this colonial greed, to take a term, or
Yeah.
maybe we need a bigger term if colonial is too associated with
Mhm.
European powers on ships.
Yeah.
If we don't know how to include Russian powers and crossing the border on foot, or
Yeah,
Chinese
100%.
powers in Tibet, we've got to come up with a new term if association is wrong. But
Well, that's hard. That's why it's so hard for us sometimes, especially when it comes to talking to like fellow Europeans, because like now that all of this is happening, we're Ukrainians, so like suddenly considered Europeans is the same, like, and in the fact, Eastern Europeans, like, because I've studied sociology in my university, and I'm no expert in like a lot of these issues, but I think like I've read enough because of my personal background and being interested in this topic of how Eastern Europeans are treated based on like ethnicity, accent, all of that in Eastern Europe. Like obviously they're like white passing and they can like adjust and adapt. And obviously they will never understand the experience of somebody who doesn't look like them when it comes. But it's also like almost now that like Europeans started taking a lot of Ukrainian refugees, suddenly they're so welcoming to us. When they weren't before, they were like, oh, you're like a second grade Europeans. You're like, we're like Western Europe is like, we are the first world Europe.
Yeah,
you're like the rest.
I can definitely validate that, growing up in Paris, I do understand that relationship from all the Eastern European coming down to whether it's in Paris or London, the way they were treated. And it's true. And compared to how they're treated now. So it's a big difference.
Yeah, I think a lot of that guilt, like played into the reason why it's suddenly like, oh, like we're treated like the same or something. But it's interesting because like specifically when we talk to Western Europeans about colonialism and how we ask them to be critical about Russia and Russia's influence in Western Europe, and how through that like influence through soft power, like, culture, and all of those things that Russia has been promoting itself for, how it kind of drifted away the attention from like the horrible things that they've been doing throughout centuries, like genocides, wars and etc. And few like activists, academics, scholars, historians have been speaking about that. They have been like essentially silenced by Russia. But when we, for example, when we say that, oh, please do not, like in respect to Ukrainians, because there's a war going on, please do not like do a theater play in France of this famous Russian artist or author because he had very chauvinistic and horrible views about Ukrainians, and these are the things that he wrote. So by platforming him right now, you kind of, helping Russia right now, because we are like fighting for our lives against them. And Europeans, when they hear that, they're like, oh, but do you mean that we should not then like watch a play of this XYZ like French author who was also very racist to like Black people that France colonized? Like, so that like and they start questioning it, and they understand that in order to like understand what we're asking them to do about Russia would force them to do the same about the former, colonies and the former nations that they've oppressed throughout like centuries, and they have not self-reflected on that. So, and sometimes it makes them uncomfortable because they realize, oh, look, we've also been the bad guys. We've also acted like Russia. So like, how does it make us?
Which is the big beast that I know we've not really mentioned in this conversation, the past of Africa and slavery, the way people trying to make it sound like, it's just something that happened. It wasn't a big deal. You know what I mean? Up until now, most of the African countries are still suffering from that experience, but nobody's doing anything about it. You know what I mean? And yeah, it can be so hypocritical sometimes, when we talk about this kind of subjects, and people don't like to go in the heart of it all, because the heart of it all hurts, because reality, oh shoot, I think I'm getting 1 second. I think I have like 5% left, Ari.
Well, maybe we go until you vanish into the ether, and then I can connect with you guys to continue the conversation. But well, I think we've talked about a lot. I mean, I wanted to respond a little bit to Julia, because I'm one of those people who, okay, to take an example, I love listening to Wagner. Wagner was famously anti-Semitic, and actually his operas were then used by the Nazis. I find it, as an artist, of course you want people to be good people, but especially when you're taking something from the past, I don't know if we have to, I understand the sentiment, but if we put artists from the past into a lens of what's going on politically now, I think personally it's a slippery slope, because one could make the argument, let's say, if we're talking about climate change as a major thing here, that every single artist who's ever driven a car should never be listened to. So that means we should listen to no rock and roll. We should watch no movies. We should see no plays from the 20th century because those people drove cars. There may be a lens in the future where every artist is disqualified because they contributed to the destruction of the planet. So, I do understand your perspective, from like when I think about Wagner and being Jewish and that he would have wanted me dead. But I question as artists what happens if you start crossing out artists from the past, or the art. Maybe the artist can be crossed out to some degree, but the work can still be, in my opinion, examined, and then through the lens of like, okay, this person had some views that I disagree with now, but they created something passed through them that has an impact, and maybe we can repurpose it in a way that's positive now. Oh, I think we lost Jimmy.
Yeah, I guess I see your point as well, and that's like a big debate. Like, do you separate the artist from the art and stuff like that? And like, obviously, you will not find perfect people, most likely. But I think like, the issue as well, like for us, a lot of the times that it's never been like looked through the lens of like a critical length, and when it comes to like Russian artists and Russian culture and their influence and the kind of things that they promoted, like cultural appropriation. Like, that's not the term that probably like a century ago was like popular used, but it is something that we talk about now. And I think obviously today, like, landscape of culture is very different, how we treat these like big artists and like their own personal like actions. And like, I agree, like maybe like completely wiping them out is not the answer, but I think applying that critical lens could be very, very useful, because then it helps like us as well, and it helps people to understand that this is not something like the war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's not something that happened on like February 24th, 2022. Like, that was my first thought when on like at 2 p.m., I think, I read the news that Russian tanks are rolling to Kyiv as I'm like sitting in Kyiv in my apartment. My first thought was like that I could be the first generation of Ukrainians who didn't suffer from Russia.
Mhm.
And I'm not. And I think that shows to how rooted this generational trauma of this entire thing is. And as for a lot of people who have been just like fascinated by the beauty of Russian culture without even examining it through any critical lens, which I think is very fair, they've suddenly like realizing like, oh, like there is more layers to it, and maybe like, oh, Russia appropriated this artist from Ukraine, because like, for example, Malevich, who's famously known as Russian in the US, he's actually Ukrainian. And I think Ukrainian activists have been like art activists have been fighting a lot to like bring that justice. And he actually was drawing and using his art to critique Stalin's regime and to critique like the feminine Ukraine. So he definitely had very
Mhm.
different views from like how he's presented, I think. And like it is like, I agree it's a slippery slope, but I kind of, and especially when it comes to like, you know, decommunization, as they call it in Ukraine, but like removing the statues to like Russian generals, for example, in Ukraine, and like completely erasing that. That's actually very similar to the debate about Confederate statues in the US, and
Mhm.
whether you kind of leave it because it's history, and some people argue that we need to like remember history even if it's not that great, or do you remove them from a public space and take them to like a museum or other
Right.
space that allows more like critical thought? Yeah.
Right. Um, I need to go in a minute because I have another call coming in, but I
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
love to just briefly ask one question of just how do you see yourself as a, you know, activist storyteller? Um, uh, one sec. I'm gonna see if
No
I can
worries, no worries, take your time.
delay this call.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, um, so, hold on a second.
No worries, take your time. Okay.
Um, yeah, I realize I have a call in 1 minute. Let me just see if I push it back a second. I just want to hear a little bit about like how you think you can, you know, we're talking a lot about history, but you know, the goal of this publication is to talk about how we capture the imagination in a entertainment driven cultural, you know, situation in the world where basically people's attention has to be grabbed by story, whether it's fiction story, true story. Do you see your role as an activist? How do you capture people's imagination? What do you, you know, something like what Jimmy did, you know, changing the speech to talk to Macron. Can you see yourself doing something like that? Or can you see yourself coming up with a fiction to tell the story?
100%. I would love to do something like something that he did, but in like obviously my kind of case. But I think for me, my goal was always to show and humanize the story of Russian invasion of Ukraine, because unfortunately, and a lot of the times, and it's understandable for audience across the world, it may just turn into just like some dry statistics, like oh, this X amount of people have died, this X amount of people of cities have been erased from the ground, and then it sort of repeats again, and people just start losing interest. So I think really using my own personal story and being like not being afraid to be vulnerable and sharing those stories on social media, I've realized that the moments when I'm the most like emotional, whether it's like anger at the uselessness of, you know, global superpowers when it comes to like injustice, or, you know, being very angry at people who, you know, justify these anger, crimes, or just overall like when it comes to climate, especially as well, like people who refuse to see the role of fossil fuels here, or European countries, you know, making a choice of like, okay, we're not going to buy Russian gas, but we're going to buy it from someone else. And I'm like, you have the best opportunity right now to change your policy. Like people have been telling you this for years, and you're doing completely like opposite thing. Like you could have this, like literally, I mean, of course, at the backs of the Ukrainian, you know, history has given you this opportunity to make this historic shift, and you're turning it to shit, unfortunately. And I think people need to see that people care, and a lot of times emotions is something that really helps me to deliver that, because a lot of the times, obviously from traditional publications or something, people don't see that. People don't really feel how Ukrainians feel on the ground. And my own, you know, activism and using my platforms is rooted in that. Like I record my grandparents who give testimonies to how they survived Russian occupation. My grandfather, he was actually being shot at from a Russian tank, but it didn't hit him. It kind of like flew above his head. And, you know, and recording how he like talks about that and then share it, posting it on social media is very powerful, especially when it comes from an individual, not just like a investigative journalist from New York Times or something like that. Because a lot of the times it's like very edited and almost scripted. And I think a lot of the times the edited and scripted stories are not being transmitted as well as anymore because of the role of social media that has played in how people perceive stories overall. Like TikTok format might be the best to now tell a story than BBC documentary, especially for my generation, I think.
Yeah, they're not. The BBC documentary is going to be preaching to the converted, and that's you know, as a storyteller focused on, you know, ecological things, you know, I look at the documentaries or the serious dramas about climate, and they're admirable, but I don't know that they are reaching the people that we want to
No.
reach.
Probably not.
But I do need to go. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk. I'm sorry we lost Jimmy, but I'm sure he expresses his
No,
love and you know, high five to you across the world.
I would have loved to talk way more with him, because I think, like, as I said, more of this kind of conversation needs to happen, and it's beneficial for both like Ukrainians and for other people to like understand definitely like what are other struggles and how we can express solidarity and act together in
Yeah.
a way that is the best for humanity overall.
Yeah, I'll connect you guys by email now. Just so, do you still using the NYU address?
Yeah. My NYU address, YT1289, I believe. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I hope to be back in Kiev.
Let me know if you're
Yeah.
here, you know,
Yeah.
like any like I can help with anything. But yeah, thank you so much and good luck with whatever you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wish you. Bye.
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 My event was moved by a few days. Would it be possible to bring them to the downtown location in the next day or so? Question mark. I think the meetings for the next couple hours, otherwise I can maybe come later in the afternoon.